So welcome to this resilience and KPI conversation. And the background behind this is I kind of see resilience as a stepping stone towards regenerative design. But regenerative design is, I think, a little far away from our current reality and the way we think about organizations and how we lead and how we assess organizations and leadership. And so I was looking at these resilience principles as a step towards regenerative design in organization and a step towards leadership from a regenerative frame. But I found the resilience frameworks to be pretty relatable in organizational terms. And so, but today, what we're going to do, instead of, a person presenting and then we go into small groups or have generalized conversation, what I'd like to do is I'll kind of present a framework, and then Daniel and Marianne and Steph are going to kind of rotate through and facilitate what's coming up in your minds about how we might create a feedback loop in our organizations that would help us understand that we're being, that we're leading or we're moving in a direction that would help our systems be more resilient. And the idea is, so this triggering event for me was I coach a lot of CEOs, and usually around springtime, they're starting to get feedback from their boards on how well they're doing leading their organizations. And the primary way they're getting feedback in their performance reviews is either through negotiated goals that they've had, like we're going to accomplish this by the end of the year, or through progress on strategic plans. But annual goals are short-term by definition, and strategic plans are maybe 3 years out, but never really reinforce long-term, like decade thinking, or as Daniel's title is, 21st century thinker, right? Is that, do I have that right, Daniel? So
each century thinker.
Yeah, so really a much more longer term. So we know regenerative systems require a long-term thinking pattern, but we're not evaluating our CEOs or our organization's leaders based on that. So we've got something off. Let's go. And so I'm just gonna share my screen here. Exit, there we go. Now we'll share. Okay, so this is, and this is very drafty. So the principles that we see or characteristics, there are a number of versions of this in the literature, but these are the ones that, for me, connected most easily with my organizational leadership work. So I'm going to talk about them, share some of my drafty performance reviews or feedback loops, and then Daniel and Marianne and Steph are going to invite us into a conversation of, well, what's rising in your head about things that might help us think about this differently. So you can say 7 resilient principles, there's 7 resilient characteristics. For me, those are different words, but basically have the same meaning. And so these are the frameworks, resilient systems always pay attention to what critical redundancies do they need to sustain themselves. How do we strengthen in nature, it's always about biodiversity. So how do we strengthen that? How do we strengthen connectivity? How do we focus on slow variables and feedback? Slow variables are things that take time, that if you lost a person that primarily held all of the financial information in their head, and it would take a long time to hire somebody and train them in, that might be a slow variable, but we'll talk about that. I'll talk about these all in more detail. How do you foster complex adaptive systems thinking? How do you create learning rich and environments? high levels of engagement and participation. In nature, nothing is apathetic. If you're apathetic, you're basically dying. And how do you promote polycentric or governance systems? Because in nature, there's more than one center. So here's the first one: strengthen diversity and redundancy. So critical redundancies are necessary in any resilient system. So Daniel and I, for example, are consulting with the Metropolitan Airport Commission. And in one of our conversations, they were talking about the equipment that cleared the runways, a critical thing to keep operating during a big snowstorm. And how, if they focused on all electric vehicles, at some point they would have to be pulled offline to clear the runway. They have this thing they call the Congo line, and they have like 6 or 7 big snow plows that go down in a kind of a staggered way down a runway, and they can clear the runway in 10 minutes. But if you have to take one of those vehicles offline because they have to get recharged, something as critical as getting the runways clear is something they have to think about. So they needed to figure out critical redundancy. But redundancy in human organizations can also be knowledge or a certain kind of special expertness that you need to run your operation. Many of our organizations are lean and mean staffing structures, sometimes for nonprofits because we don't have money. And so we, have one person in a startup or maybe 2 or 3, but we're always conserving on staffing. But in resilient systems, that kind of lean staffing structure often means that you don't have critical redundancy where you need it. And then the biodiversity, what biodiversity does to resilience is it creates the possibility of mutual relationships, mutual sharing of or exchanging of resources or knowledge that creates synergy in the organization, and you get more than what you actually have. And so the opposite of biodiversity in a farming metaphor would be monocultures. So monocultures always increase fragility. More biodiversity, like the prairie versus the corn crop field. One is a monoculture, but the diversity of a prairie allows it to accept all resources that fall on it. So coming from that, key performance indicators might be, there's this concept of institutional diversity. It comes from Wacker and Taylor, who wrote a book called The 500-Year Delta. And in that kind of critical institutional diversity, their point is that the world itself is a very diverse place. And if you only have white men leading the market research or thinking about their product, they're missing out from other potential buyers or customers because they don't design their products for the diversity of cultures that exist in the world. And so they talk about this thing called institutional diversity, where you have enough diversity at the table that you can see the different possible marketplaces that might be interested in your work. That's kind of an institutional frame. Another might be, we could measure, do we even know what our critical redundancies are in our organization where we need to have backup? I've sometimes gone into organization and asked questions of staff to ask, do you, if you were out for 6 months on a medical leave, who would be able to take over your functions, your responsibilities, and would have the knowledge to cover your work while you were out? A lot of organizations and individuals can't answer that question. Do you have bench strength in critical knowledge areas that are needed for your organization to thrive? And have you created conditions of safety and trust so that the diversity of perspective can be can emerge in the conversation? So I will let Daniel start this off with a framework or Q&A and collectively.
Yeah, so thank you, Kathy. I really appreciate the context around strengthening diversity and redundancy. And so what we want to do is Kathy's going to share context around each of these 7 principles of resilience. And then we want to have a large group conversation. And this is the question we want to center it around, and I'll drop this in the chat. What ways can we create feedback loops that strengthen this resilient characteristic in our organization? So kind of riffing off of what Kathy put on the lower half of the screen, but really the question is like, okay, we know what the principles of a resilient system are. How do we create feedback loops that actually strengthen these characteristics in our organization? So you can call them a KPI if you want, you can call it measurement if you want, but I don't want you to get caught up on that. Really, if I'm from a living systems language, it's what is the feedback loop that needs to be created that reinforces this resilient characteristic? And it's large group conversation. So Kathy, maybe you can minimize your screen and just drop those KPIs into chat so we can see them, but then we get to see each other's faces more so than the slides.
So what do you think? Anything pop for you? Do you also resonate with the redundancy question, for example? The resilience frame?
I can jump in with one thought, and you named this one, Kathy. I think it was critical redundancies are identified, because I think about nature is very redundant, but it also doesn't waste energy. So it's redundant only where it's critical. And I think about us as humans and breathing. We have 3 orifices in which we can breathe. So if any one is closed, one nostril or the other, or the mouth, we have 2 other options. Or if 2 are plugged, we can still breathe because that's critical. But we don't have, 10 arms. So because everything in nature takes resources and energy to create. So from an organization, it really is a question. And I don't know what the exercise would look like, but what is that critical function that we need to have redundancy for? The other really mechanical example, this is airplanes. You don't want a lot of weight on airplanes, but guess what? They have 3 systems built in to lower the landing gear, because it would be a big problem if the landing gear didn't work. They have a pneumatic mechanical system, they have an electronic system, and they have a just plain old manual, like levers that are connected to be able to crank it down. So that struck me as, what are those critical functions in our organizations that it's worth investing in redundancy?
Something I've learned when I've gotten involved with Lynn Moore's Acres for Life organization, it's a nonprofit, and using a framework that we talked about in December on this call, but was thinking about opposites, like a feedback loop. And Kathy, you I think alluded to this, but if to figure out what is the redundant, the critical pieces, well, let's think of it if we weren't here. What is the opposite? If it's not here, could it carry on, or could we move forward, or would we die, or would we, an animal not get fed? That kind of a situation. So I think asking opposite is a feedback loop in those discussions.
Yeah, Mary Ellen.
This is a wonderment on my part that struck me when Daniel was talking about our own bodies. And then he mentioned the planes. I can't help but think about a hidden, a passive, I'm not quite sure which word I want yet, but for instance, a respiratory organ of your body that you didn't mention, Daniel, but
Oh, did we lose her? Anybody else?
Yeah, I think she's frozen. So we'll come back to that.
I see
Sylvia
how. Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry. I was going to say about then the last aspect of this around trust is so important here too. And, because I got to trust if my nose is plugged that I can breathe through my mouth. And so like when we think about those other folks that we're working with in organizations, the trust that they'll be there. And so I'm thinking about that indicator of like, what are the signs and signals of knowing that we have a trust, like an organization where people deeply trust each other. And it kind of goes to Mary Ann's question and involving them of if we all were together discussing about what the opposite of this would be, like building the trust even within those conversations with each other, I think could be, really interesting. I'm just going into like for if I'm evaluating an executive director as a board member, like what would I look for, right? And I think like, so it's not that I wouldn't look for necessarily that we had the conversation about opposites, but it's like what trust was engendered by these conversations and how do I know that that's happening? Yeah.
Fantastic. I want to make sure, oh, we have a hand. So we don't know how to manage our time. Kathy has 7 principles to go through. Emily, do you want to say one thing about this one since you just raised your hand, and then we move on to the next principle because they are connected. So comments might stimulate across principles too.
I can hold it if we're crunched. The piece that Stephanie was just talking about, the trust, there's a tension that I see, which is what as a leader have I done if I'm being evaluated on my own performance versus recognizing the interconnectedness. And so this piece, which is probably coming up, that there is this kind of tension of recognizing it, and then to say what is redundant. Like I work in the government, so even trying to get positions and anticipate when somebody leaves, there's so much time. It can take a year to fill a position. And so anyway, there's a struggle here of how do we recognize all of that. But I'm going to be quiet for Kathy to continue.
Well, this is beautiful because the next one is about connectivity and how most resilient organizations are aware of their connectivity. They have connectivity and they see themselves as interconnected, and they have structures and processes that support the interconnection. And of course, the opposite is that silos are not about connectivity, they're about separation. And silos tend to be actually an indicator of fragility rather than an indicator of resilience. So one organization, we experimented with turning an organizational chart into a tree instead of a pyramid structure with little boxes, where people at the front line of the organization saw themselves at the lower level of the pyramid with all these people above them, which made them invisible and vulnerable, which again led to the safety and trust as being minimized. And what happened was we put the leadership team in the root structure, all of the backroom infrastructure, finance, HR, technology, etc., in the trunk, bringing the resources from the soil up and bringing the resources from photosynthesis down through the tree. And then we put the programmatic or product folks kind of in the bigger branches branching off from the trunk. And then we put the frontline people in the smaller branches and hanging on to the leaves. So the leaves bring the energy of the sun, turns it into a nutrient that the tree can use to grow and spread it down from the top. And of course, trees rarely hang out separately. They are embedded in an external environment. But what we did here, instead of the pyramid, was we were trying to deliberately help people see the connectivity of the system. And when you're part of a whole tree, you can't think that you're a silo. You have to see yourself as in relationship with. But oftentimes when you see yourself as separate or siloed, the backroom structures tend to be seen as cost centers. And those who are bringing in money tend to have higher value. And so you have this first class, second class citizen dynamic in organizations. So the question is, and hierarchies actually tend to minimize connectivity, and networks tend to expand the connectivity. And most organizations have both and. So here are some questions, you know, how are we leading an integrated whole instead of a set of parts? So when I was at St. Ben's, our cabinet came together and identified the purpose of our cabinet, which was to fiercely defend the institution so it could thrive in the future. That was our framework for our purpose. It wasn't to fiercely defend your area or division of the organization. It was to fiercely defend the future of the organization. That was an expression to try to identify how we were integrated. What is the quality of your relationships in your organization? And do you coach your staff to develop the same quality? Again, relationships are often seen as a soft variable or a softness in the organization, as opposed to getting the job done, tasky stuff, right? But resilience would teach us that we have to pay attention to the quality of our relationships and what structures and processes reinforce interconnections in our organization and between our organization and the external environment. So I think, Marianne, you're up.
Yeah, so these are wonderful questions. And Kathy, if you could take us to the, so we can, or if everyone can look at the chat. Again, Daniel pasted the, you know, what ways can we create feedback loops that strengthens this resiliency? It can basically, you know, that nurtures and strengthens connectivity. You know, maybe people have examples that they've seen that do that. Anyone care to jump in?
Yeah, I've got one process, if that helps. We take people out walking in nature. And I quite often talk about that very same free idea about imagining. But yeah, by walking in nature, you connect people because you're instilling flow states, because they develop neurotransmitters. And when you're in that flow state, one of the big ones obviously is anandamide, which gives different connections across the brain, so you come up with more creativity, but you also create serotonin and other states that relax you, and also serotonin and oxytocin, because you're together. So the great thing about going on walks is that you can only have two people walking at the same time, so the conversations are good, and then when you're fed up with that person, you can just drop back or tie your shoelace up, and then you get, but by the time you've done, you know, a few miles, everyone's kind of had a chance to chat to each other. So that's one way of doing it.
That's fun. I love the connection to the emotional chemicals,
Thank
the
you, Murph.
chemicals in our body and emotions.
This makes me think about how we spend our time, and being a private sector consulting company, it's almost like we're always counting billable hours. So if we want to create a structure that focuses on connection, we need to have an hour category or a language and story at our company about how important it is to spend your time connecting with somebody else, and not just be like, I'm in the office, I got to zoom in on my work and be task oriented because that's what I got to do to be effective. And I think that a lot of people have different relationships with, everybody has a different relationship with time, and a company or organizational structure can either reinforce positive relationships with time or negative ones. And we've had team members over the years who have struggled with the fact that we have to track our hours, and then how do I clock my time when I'm at the water cooler, chatting with a colleague and catching up on things and building relationship, or build it into team meetings would be another thing. So maybe the KPI here is like, how do we think about and put a structure in place about what we value, how we spend our time? There's a cleaner way of saying that, but you get the drift.
Yeah. Thank you, Daniel. In the interest of time, I want to recognize Sylvia. She said she needed to type her comments today, so she's been doing some nice chatting. But she has a question. If we have a network mindset and seek to build connections, we inevitably walk invisible walls of hierarchical silos. This can create fear and misunderstanding. Any suggestions on how to address this? Anybody have a quick comment on that? And then I'll hand it over to Steph and Kathy and Steph on the next one.
I think one of the things that we don't recognize is that our hierarchies are fragile. And they actually interfere with a lot of these other characteristics of resilience, which I'll talk a little bit more about as we get into it. So there's something about the hierarchy structure that reinforces separation and reinforces who counts and who doesn't count, and reinforces trust and fear and emotional content and in our culture, in our workplace. So at some point we have to deal with that. And then maybe as we get through this, we'll begin to understand the interconnections and how our current structures actually make us more fragile than resilient.
Thanks, Kathy. I think
Shall we go?
Laura and Daniel, is any other comments there? Maybe folks can read, because I want to make Kathy, if you want to go on to
So we keep
principles.
kind of moving forward.
That's right.
So the next one is slow variables. I love this framework of slow variables and feedback. So a slow variable in nature would be the comparison of soil. Amending the soil is a slow variable, and the quality of the harvest, which is a fast variable. So excuse me for a minute. So the concept of a slow variable is something that you need in the future to be continue to strengthen, because it takes time to build. So one of my current questions is, what is a slow variable in an organization? Is it talent? Is it people? Is it culture? Is it something else? And so the simple KPI from my perspective is that you would have to actually spend some time in your organization identifying those things that would be a slow variable and demonstrate how you're continuing to enhance. But what's our default? Our building trust is a slow variable. Absolutely, Daniel. But we would have to look at it and say, when we have tough budget years, we cut out professional development, for example, because we think that's a kind of an extraneous program cost that we or organizational costs. So I'm choking, and I'm going to hand it off to Steph, because
Okay. Yeah, thanks, Kathy. Yeah. Well, this is really interesting. This is my first time hearing about slow variables, and so I'm really intrigued by this. So same question that we're posing to you all, and I'm going to pop it into the chat again. So what ways can we create feedback loops that strengthen this resilient characteristics in our organization? And Kathy, if you want to take us so that we can see each other again.
Yep.
So we talked about knowing what our slow variables are. And then, Murph said, yeah, culture for sure. And trust is coming up here. What else is coming to mind to you as you think of slow variables and our feedback loops for building this characteristic?
think of, if you're a gardener or have a farming background or something like that, it takes time to amend the soil.
Yes.
So that you can optimize your harvests. And so what are those things in organizational leadership or life that take time to develop in an organization in order for you to gain the harvest that you're hoping for example? Hey, Christine.
Hello.
Murph, I saw you come off of mute. Do you have a thought?
Oh, my apologies. I just accidentally tapped it. I'm so sorry.
Oh, you're totally good. Yeah, Murphy, what?
Yeah, something else that just sprung to mind is the reason why I said culture, and I think trust is part of that. I find that organisations that kind of try to go with the old paradigm of continual growth tend to grow, get the wrong people, and then have to lose them all. Eventually they get to this point of, I call it super teams now, but it used to be the elite team thing, where they get people who they really trust. And as a result of that, they form self-managing teams, and they they grow them fractally. So they wait until they've got the right people. They get to a point where they get so fed up with going up and down in numbers and that they get this core team, and the team do really well. So, and then the other thing that came to me was, yeah, sometimes it's serendipity. You know, you can be trying to grow for 10 years. This has happened to a client of mine recently. And, you know, they keep going up and down. And then pandemic, it worked well for them. So there's also this serendipity, which is a slow thing that perhaps sometimes you got to wait for the right weather.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah. Other thoughts, ideas on this? Yeah, Kathy.
I think this goes to the deep culture of the organization. So some organizations I've worked in, activity was a measure of your worth in the organization, or how many hours have you worked this week was a badge of honor and comparison of your value to yourself, and the assumption was to the organization. And but a slow variable is not necessarily where we tend to focus or pay attention to. We don't look at the organization, say, and ask the question, how do we nurture something that needs time to grow and get stronger? And our main culture, which makes us all more fragile, is we're focused on activity rather than or style versus substance or other kinds of things like that.
Yeah. Emily.
I'm really appreciating the timing on this conversation. So there's two thoughts. One is what happens when you bring in like that superstar, right? You get hire that person that you really think is going to come in and transform an organization. And yet because of the environment in which they're joining, they can't thrive. They've been set up to fail because there's enough around it. So there's this balance too. So I think it's Murph, your point about the team, and there's already trust in that can then work, right? If they already know each other, they've got the right conditions, all of that. The other piece is, how do we create a culture where feedback awakens rather than shuts down, gets defensive, and all of that? Because the feedback that needs to be said, there's too much fear to actually say it because this person might become my boss, or there might be a lawsuit. Like there's all these other things that are preventing honest conversation about what is working, what isn't working.
Daniel.
I love that, Emily, and I have a perfect example of that. Our team tries to foster good feedback and open communication. And just recently, my business partner, who's a boss, received some feedback about a process that it was messy and confusing. And in a team meeting, he said thank you to the person who gave him the feedback. So it was hard feedback, and he thanked the person giving the hard feedback. So I don't know what impact that has across our team because nobody said anything. But the way I received that was other people will be more comfortable giving hard feedback to anybody else on the team, even if it is a boss or somebody at a higher level. So I don't know how you measure that, but that seems like a practice, that thanking people for feedback, even when it's hard, and doing it at least somewhat socialized, if not in front of everybody, in front of more than just the person who gave you that feedback, reinforces that difficult feedback is welcome because it helps us grow.
I worked with an organization that was had a previous boss who believed everything should be perfect. And so when the person who hired me came on board, he realized he had to figure out a way to get the organization to start taking risks and not have it perfect the first time out of the chute. And so one of his ways was they created a kind of a recognition award called the Turkey Award. And it was basically, you could only nominate yourself for that award. So it was, one was, I can't remember the positive one. It was like, you know, so they always paired them up. A Turkey Award, which was basically designed to lift up something that you personally did that month or that week or whatever, that was embarrassing and made you express a vulnerability about yourself, but also that you were human and not perfect. And so what happened was they also gave gift certificates for both the good recognition of behavior So they're reinforcing positive behavior that could be nominated by anybody. And then also self-nominating some mistake that you did or something that you did that was not very good. And so it was a way of shifting organizational culture, but also it brought more humanity into the organization, more hubris into the organization, and it slowly started to work against the culture of perfection.
Laura, I see you, and we've got 4 more of these principles yet, and I know that we're hoping to get through them. And so I'm hoping that maybe your comment, because I'm already seeing the interconnection between all these things. And so I bet your comment will still be relevant in our next one. So Kathy, how about let's go to the next one?
So this one was a bit ephemeral to try to get a feedback loop on, but mostly resilient systems are focused on ongoing adaptation, learning, and thinking in systems. So if you were on the call for Aman last month, he talked about seeing systems as flow, patterns, relationships, and synergistic connections, which I thought was a beautiful kind of phrase and set of frameworks to see the system, to feel the system, to see how everything is interrelated to everything else. And this also invites us to practice the not knowingness of leadership culture. The leadership culture tends to be one of, I'm supposed to know everything and know how to solve things. But this would be another way of saying, how can I see myself as a leader in the organization and still be open to the idea that I don't know how to solve things. And so it's really about more facilitating learning to figure out what the problem is and figure out the solution collectively. So, but one thought I had, which might give us feedback, would be, can we create an intentional reflection points in our organization to help make meaning of how the system is evolving, flowing, what patterns are emerging, how's our connectivity and our relationships, and what are we noticing about those connections? And then how can I personally be more comfortable with not knowing as a leader function? And how can not just one, but a kind of a critical mass of people be able to see the patterns and flow in the system? Daniel, I think you're up.
Yeah, you know the drill. I'll keep it short and sweet. Same question. What is the, sorry, I've got to pull the question up so I don't have it memorized. What ways can we create feedback loops that strengthen this fostering complex adaptive systems thinking in our organization? I'll drop the question in chat again. And Laura.
Steph was right. It's also applicable to this one. So building off, seeing the patterns and being okay with not knowing. I think it's Ben and Jerry's. They have an example where in your yearly performance review, you are not eligible for your bonus unless you can document and explain not only 1 or 2 massive failures that you had, but also what you learned from that failure. So we wrap it around learning agility and how do we be okay with knowing what to do when we don't know what to do, or learning our way through. So that's all I wanted to say.
I thought I saw a hand go up. Did it go back down, Mark?
That's me. This is not necessarily about the feet on the ground thing, but what hits me in so many of these things is how important humility is, especially in people as they get in higher leadership positions. And when that is encouraged, that I think people throughout an organization feel so much, there's a humanity that's tied to that, and so much more comfortable that they can bring something to the table that's equally important to the people who traditionally are maybe in the leadership positions.
Wow, I love that.
I think,
How important humility is. Oh, I was going to add one thing too, Kathy.
Yeah.
When I think about how do you create feedback loops around this, one thing that helps me see complex adaptive systems is this concept of zooming out, and most people get that because we all have cameras that can zoom in and zoom out. So I wonder if there's something, a feedback loop around how often are you pausing to zoom out and start to look at the relationships versus always being zoomed in. Kathy, you had something.
Well, I was going to say that this framework of thinking in systems requires us to see the world as an emerging place. So things are changing, things are evolving. There's a lot of disruption. The disruption's not going to go away. So that means this is going to be a critical framework to our own capacity to be proactive in adapting to things. And Lynn, I noticed you had a comment. Do you want to talk about that?
Sylvia also has a comment after Lynn.
Yeah.
Sure. I love these calls, and I'm grateful to be here today. Just so many things in my head are kind of exploding. But I was thinking about the concept of natural flow and thinking about everything around us. Like you talk about, nature, and us being in nature is moving, flowing in some way, and asking ourselves, what we try to do here in our framework is identifying what is that flow in myself right now? What is the flow in the environment? What is the flow in others around me? And what can I do or not do? That's equally as important to enhance the flow or join the flow that is already happening.
Mm.
That's beautiful. I'm going to read Sylvie's comment. She had two. One was, when it comes to managing complexity, discomfort is a common response. So how do we create more comfort with discomfort, the not knowingness in organizational settings? And then
I just want to
also
say thank you so much for, I know you're interrupting. I just want to say thank you so
Yeah.
much for voicing the words. I'm in the hallway. I can't really speak, but thank you so much.
Of course, your voice is important. Thank you for typing it. And then also in response to Mark, humility is a quality of character we instinctively recognize, not one that's easy to develop from the outside in when leaders lack it.
Ooh, deep thoughts.
Great conversation. I'm going to keep us moving. There's another principle that Kathy wants to share. And again, they're all pretty well connected.
So learning is a characteristic of resilient systems, active learning, the speed and acceleration of learning. Because if you are learning, you're paying attention to what's going on, you're seeing what's evolving, you're seeing what's disrupting a certain way of thinking, and it accelerates your ability to adapt. So tightly held practices and unconscious bias in a system basically create fragility. And so learning is an anecdote to that. So here would be a couple of possible KPIs, that the organization demonstrates that they are learning from feedback. And that is done at a conscious level and an applied level. I used to ask this as an organizational audit question. How many times do you make a mistake before you don't repeat it? So the KPI is we make a mistake once, we learn from them, we don't repeat or make a mistake again. And problems only happen once because you're learning, you're accelerating your learning, and you're solving it in a way, or learning from a mistake and then not happy doing it again. Marianne, I think you're up.
Yeah, I am. So as Daniel eloquently said, we kind of know the question to ask and answer, but the feedback loop. But I guess with that in mind, anyone have some ideas or thoughts around feedback loop around learning rich environment in a resilient organization? Joanne, I see you raising your hand. So if you want to unmute yourself, there you go.
So in the organization that I work in, there is a group of us that meets like once every 2 weeks. And usually at the beginning of the time, we have a reflection, just something to settle us. And I'm thinking that one of the prompts for that could be something like, name something that you've learned in the past since we've last met, or name something that you really failed out well and what you learned from that. But just kind of building that into the way we work together.
I
Yeah,
love that.
Joanne.
It
Oh,
failed well in. I love that.
yeah. Yeah, just your comment and then about this like sharing with others, it's like, because I think there are examples in nature where like nature also doesn't let others fail either. Like they spread the message of like, don't go there, don't do this, right? And so the learning doesn't just stick with, you know, the one who experienced it. It gets spread so that people or, you know, organisms know. And so I think we're not as good about doing that, like, you know, talking about our, like what we've learned and then, you know, in talking about our failures, and just letting everybody else know too. Don't make the same mistake.
Okay, cool. Murph, I think with this one, I believe Murph added online, the first right answer isn't always the best right answer. We move from problem solving to evolution. That's great. Yep.
Deep thought.
Looks like Lynn's unmuted. Go ahead,
Yeah,
Lynn.
I was just thinking about too, the idea of our reaction versus response and being more aware of in this environment. Like sometimes when something maybe negative doesn't go how we want, we may tighten. I'm just thinking like even clench, or we find ourselves tight. And I think in organizations, relationships in general, if there can be, I mean, that maybe that's just the reaction that happens, but if we can pause, we have a saying here, pause, breathe, believe. And if we can train ourselves or get into that pause, remember to breathe, right? And then we loosen up more, I think more opportunity is going to happen for these things we're talking about.
I was talking to a coaching client this morning, and she is starting a book. She buys books for her staff that she thinks are important, and then has conversations about as a kind of another modeling discipline frame. Okay, so just two more, and these kind of go hand in hand. So I'm going to go through both of them and then hand it off to Steph. So basically, resilient systems have extraordinarily high levels of engagement. And so one of the things it does is it brings more talent to the problem solving, and triggers that evolution comment that Murph had just talked about. Passive acceptance actually increases the fragility because it increases the pressure on usually the positional leader to solve the problems. I ran into this dynamic in an organization. The unequal distribution of benefits and burdens increase fragility in an organization. So the CEO really wanted to change the culture so it would become much more engaged, but they saw her as the owner of the organization. She was getting the big bucks to lead the organization. And when I was doing individual interviews with them to try to understand the culture, they said, you know, we don't own the problem. It's really her problem. So why should I spend energy and engagement helping them solve their problem that they're going to benefit disproportionately from, as opposed to us? So that was a mental framework that, you know, unless you talk to people, you don't know that it's operating in your system. So hierarchies, because of this ownership framework, tend to actually not reward engagement, no matter how much they say we want engagement. We don't necessarily increase people's pay on their engagement. There's all kinds of reward structures, but there's not much based in engagement. So it raises some interesting questions, you know. So how do we create this sense of safety and trust, which is a replication of something that we talked about earlier on diversity and critical redundancy? You know, 3M has a beautiful way that they support it. innovation that actually also supports engagement in the work. And that's, they give, I think, 10 or 15% of everybody's job description can be used for their own projects of innovation. And they're one of the most innovative companies over decades. They have a 100-year report that talks about how much of their current profits were focused on giving people time to play with their own interesting ideas. So this raises some really interesting questions of how we are and are not actually creating cultures of engagement. And then this last one is pretty interesting, which is how do you promote polycentric governance systems, so in a resilient system, that's why I use this node. They have multiple nodes on their network that are initiating and engaging and helping to deliver on impact or programs or other things, rather than just one hierarchical frame where the people, the one person or the leadership team at the top are basically responsible for everything. So I use this framework of distributive leadership or leaderful organizational cultures, which tend to be leadership at multiple levels all the way down, to help us think about a polycentric. Now, this is kind of like a food web versus a food chain in nature. So if a food chain goes off, everything above what dies out in the middle dies off, because there's only one way to get nutrients to these in a single food chain. But a food web, if one species dies off, then there are other species that can generate nutrients for people in the system. So that's the kind of framework of polycentric governance system. So here, do we have multiple centers of multi-level leadership within the organization? Think about this with sometimes in organizations, there are dysfunctional or toxic leaders. And these frameworks of, if you have a toxic leader at the top of a hierarchy, the whole organization can go down. And so, you have to have these multiple centers of strength that keeps your organization healthy, and then demonstrate multiple level leadership. How might that happen? So I'll pass it off to you, Steph.
Yeah, we've got about 4 minutes before we've reached the hour. So putting these two together, this polycentric governance systems and engagement, what are our feedback loops for strengthening these characteristics? Yeah, Murph had put, that leadership is a behavior, not a position. Hierarchy triggers dominance, behavior systems. Yep. Other
That
thoughts?
was one thought I had as we were going through this a bit, is just flipping the language throughout all of this about leadership, and have the leadership be demonstrated to do X and leadership to do X, and a leadership program I used to run, we called it nurturing leaders across this community. And we shifted it to nurturing leadership across this community. And it started to set a different tone, that, again, to basically saying what Murph said in much fewer and more eloquent words.
Yeah, Murph, other thoughts?
Yeah, leadership is an emergent process that happens, and it's triggered by the event, the enthusiasm of a particular person. They might have expertise or experience or an enlightened thought. In the special forces, they call it, I think the SEALs, they call it dynamic subordination. Like who's go through the door first, everyone else follows, they're the leader. And in self-managing teams, it would be like that. And then instead of looking at it as leaders, which is a positional thing based on the last 10,000 years, leadership as facilitator or coach or whatever, rather than call them leaders, just get rid of it. If it's a problem, get rid of the bloody thing and just call people, you're a facilitator of this team, or train you as a facilitator so we can have a group discussion and tap into collective intelligence. What we're trying to get out the goldfish bowl by swimming in a different direction in the goldfish bowl. We face one shark, swim away from that shark to find another shark. Just get out of freaking water. Perhaps.
There was a CEO of president of a community college in Arizona, the largest community college there. He was a big fan of Margaret Wheatley, and he was trying to figure out how to transform engagement in the college. And what he did was he took everybody in the who would facilitate a meeting, he taught them how to facilitate instead of taught them how to run a meeting. And it fundamentally changed their culture just by shifting the language and the training.
Yeah. Cool. That might be where we have to stop, unfortunately. Like, man, we could have kept going. But so thank you all today for this great discussion and for playing with this structure with us about having the conversation woven throughout. That was pretty fun. Yeah, and Daniel has put in the chat for what we're going to do next time. Daniel's actually going to do a summary for us of the IPCC climate change report. And we'll have a discussion about that. So looking forward to all of that. That is on April 18th, same time, 1 p.m. Central. Thank you all so much. This was really great today. Thank you, Kathy, for providing all of these great insights for us to dig into. Really great.
And it starts to invite us as a group to maybe start actively learning together instead of having a traditional presentation kind of frame. So I offer that as a possible framing for us. So thank you.
Thanks, everybody. We'll see you
everyone.
April 18th.
Okay.
Glad you could hop back on, Mary Ellen. Sorry you got cut off earlier. Oh, you're muted.
You're on mute, Mary Ellen.
It was an ongoing Wi-Fi issue I had initially, and I was frustrated because it kept going off and on. Anyway, I didn't know whether you pursued that or responded
It
or.
wasn't happening to others on the call, so.
No, I mean my my question.
Oh, your question got
my
cut off
wonderment,
before
yes.
you. Yeah, it got cut off before we could hear it.
Oh.
Sorry.
Yeah. Well, I think
I have to hop off. It's really good to see you all.
Thank you.
Take care, Daniel. Thank you so much. See you next month.
Okay.
No, I have to go as well. Shoot.
Yeah.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Bye.
Mary Ellen,
Bye.
we're gonna
Bye.
thank you, Mary Ellen and Mary Ann.
Thank you. Bye.
Ready. Take care. Bye.